Hello everyone, my name is Peter Chai. So for my presentation today, I will basically be talking about social movements in mainland China from the 1990s. In my presentation today, I will basically be summarizing some of the important findings or results from some journal articles and book chapters that talk about the social movements both online and offline in mainland China. In my presentation, I will not only be explaining about why post-materialism is difficult to be interpreted by social movements in mainland China, but also I will suggest some possible research in the future that can be conducted by scholars to target at some recent debates that resemble the increasing social cleavages and value gaps that can be seen by both observers inside China and outside China. So some scholars have been working on some research that tries to find patterns or trends that categorize the environmental movements in mainland China. And one example of such research is done by Li and Ho. So basically, from my perspective, there are two types of environmental protests in mainland China from the end of 1990s to the early 2000s. The first type is targeting at saving the natural habitats of endangered species, animals, and plants. So some examples include saving the snub-nosed monkeys in Yunnan, 1995 to 1997, saving the Tibetan antelope in Qinghai from 1996 to 2000, as well as a campaign against the New River Dam project from 2003 to 2006. In those movements and campaigns, much attention has been placed on improving the quality of life and saving the species around us that live in the same earth as us. However, not much attention or emphasis has been placed on improving the quality of life enjoyed by local citizens or human beings. The other type of environmental campaigns are PX protests by local citizens, and some examples including the ones in Xiamen, 2007, Dalian in 2011, Ningbo in 2012, Kunming in 2013, and Maoming in 2014. As you can see on the right-hand side, this map is extracted from Li and Ho's research. You can see the spots where the PX chemical factories were constructed or planned to be constructed by 2014, as well as those places where anti-PX protests happened that were participated by the local citizens. So some protests are targeting at improving the living standards of other species. And other protests, for example, the anti-PX protests by local citizens, they focus more on the physical security and health of local residents who are humans. Probably both types of the environmental movements, they resemble a tendency for the participants to voice post-materialist opinions and ideas. So the first type resembles a desire to care for species outside human beings ourselves. And the second type resembles a desire to engage in governmental decision-making and local politics. Beyond environmental activism, actually there are some other types of symbolic incidents of online activism, starting from early 2000s. On the right, you can see a list of online protests or online incidents summarized by Yang. According to Yang, those incidents focused on neo-nationalism against Japan, passioning against some covering up of certain legal cases by local politicians, and environmentalism, as we discussed in the previous slide. And according to Yang, those incidents online are rather spontaneous, episodic, and fluid. And rather than being active, they are pretty reactive to some certain social issues or some legal cases. They did not target at political regime change, but instead focused on individual events And due to this nature, they are pretty unpredictable. So they are not pre-organized social movements. And Yang also argues that with the reform and opening up, marketization and rapid but uneven economic growth across different provinces and regions, mainland China's regions have observed the degradation of the environment, more pollution, and actually a struggle over a disappearing socialist or collectivist social security and job allocation system. This makes some social groups winners and others losers. With the advent of the information economy, such social cleavages combined with an increased civic and personal rights awareness and attention to social injustice and legal cases, and disadvantaged and marginalized social groups, more people tend to be active and made use of such online traffic and online platforms, such as social media and bloggers' websites. And Yang also argues that while CCP was quite sensitive towards certain discussions, such as those about the 1989 pro-democracy Tiananmen incident, CCP was actually not so sensitive towards some other types of discussions, such as discussions regarding the local politicians' corruption or some local human rights legal cases. Beyond the environmental movements, as well as the movements that targeting at trying to make local politics and local officials more transparent in some legal cases and so on, some other types of collective actions have been observed in mainland China. On the right, you can see some of those collective actions that are summarized by various scholars that study collective actions in China. Those issues include demolition, labor unrest, local tax rights, taxi driver strikes, veterans activism, and so on. So to some degree, they underline the division between individual freedom and autonomy and state control and rule. Also, it is important to note that various post-materialist issues probably have not been co-moving at a similar rate or similar pace. For example, as we discussed, environmental discussions online and offline have been quite observable and extensive, whereas discussions on feminism and LGBTQ plus and sexual minorities issues have not been as much discussed compared to environmentalism in mainland China. And also, it is important to note that materialist and post-materialist sentiments have been intertwined and combined in some of the discussions. For example, the discussion on demolition. Not only that the local residents, they want to defend their residency, but also they care a lot about the compensation and the money they could receive from the local politicians and so on. So on the one hand, they care about their voice, their expression of ideas. And on the other hand, they care about the financial compensation they could receive. And also, what some researchers have emphasized regarding the mainland China's collective actions and social movements is that the netizens online, with the advent of the information economy and the development of several social media platforms such as Weibo and QQ, the netizens actually realized that their voices could be spread across regions and times, so that the information online have the potential to be transformed across time and space. So they have some degree of confidence in this nature of diffusion of the modern internet. And also why governments have been quite sensitive towards some internet contents, and why there is a strong state machine to censor and remove or erase certain sensitive contents on social media platforms, is that the government actually realized that there is some degree of potential for the online discussions to be materialized in the future into offline protests, which can be more dangerous, that can challenge the regime to some degree. Some of the recent emerging political debates in China were not captured or investigated by the previous researchers that I've mentioned in the previous slides. So some of the topics that have been emerging include the sexual orientation and sexual minorities' rights, as well as the ethnic culture plurality debate and the local autonomy debate, as reflected by the protests in Hong Kong, as well as some discussions on the problem with Xinjiang forced labor and concentration camps. Also, some recent debate include human trafficking of some of the rural areas' women, and also the anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination voices appearing on the internet, when China has been employing rather high-pressure policies toward the combat against the COVID-19 spreading. And lastly, some of the recent debates include the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Some of the discussions have been supporting Russia and some are not. So those value gaps and social cleavages that are reflected by those really polarized debates in mainland China have reflected an uprise of post-materialism in the recent years. One interesting observation to be made in the future and for researchers to analyze in the future is whether President Xi's stability and harmonious society political philosophy can actually be sustained in face of the increasingly polarized political debates and cleavages online, and whether the CCP will be successful in manually creating a self-fulfilling prophecy to re-emphasize on the cultural relativism that China has.